Large open bogs are one ecological community type within a larger landscape setting defined by glacial geology. These large, low-gradient basins form a complex of ecological communities that include wetland and upland community types and are broadly referred to as boreal lowlands. Here we see conifer-dominated uplands grading into conifer-dominated peatlands and then into a large open bog. Much of the uplands in this area were scoured by fire in the early 20th century, and these nutrient-poor upland soils support conifer lowland forest and woodlands. Bay Pond Bog, seen here, is one of 3 known occurrences of pattern peatlands in New York State, and these are among the southernmost occurrences of pattern peatlands in North America. The hummocks and hollows of pattern peatlands provide habitat variability that make them more diverse than most peatland types. Patterning seen here amounts to a distinctive washboard-like pattern of elongated hummocks and hollows, perpendicular to the gentle slope of the peatland. Hummocks, or high spots, have a lighter color and are dominated more by vascular plants. Hollows, low spots, have a darker color and are at the level of the water table. Patterning is dependent on cool climates and the result of subtle differences in hydrology and plant species. These slight differences in plant species composition amplify differences in nutrient availability, elevation, and hydrology of hummocks and hollows as follows. Hollows are wetter, dominated by sphagnum mosses, and have higher acidity and lower nutrients, favoring the persistence of sphagnum mosses. Hummocks are drier and dominated by vascular plants. Because evapotranspiration is greater in vascular plants, water is drawn from the hollows to the hummocks, and over time concentrates nutrients in hummocks, favoring the persistence of vascular plants. Since the rate of plant growth on hummocks is often higher, peat tends to accumulate faster in hummocks than in hollows, reinforcing the development of hummocks. When vascular plants on these hummocks die, the peat that is formed does not pass water easily, reinforcing the peatland patterning by restricting the slow-moving water to the hollows. Patterning begins to disappear as we move toward the edge of the peatland, where shrubs tend to dominate, and then grade into more trees at the edge of the bog. Hydrology, the amount, timing, and movement of water, is the most important factor in the distribution of plants in peatlands. The rate at which water can move through soils, hydraulic conductivity, is highly variable in peatlands and depends on the stage of decomposition as well as the type of vegetation that was present in the past. Hydraulic conductivity is also dependent on the type of mineral substrate, that is, the type of underlying glacial deposits that preceded the development of peat soils. Here, on the right of the screen, we see the signature orangish color of leatherleaf in the bog. Leatherleaf is a broadleaf evergreen plant. Its leaves don't all fall off at once in the fall, and tolerant of acidic peat soils. On the left, along the river corridor, we see the verdant annual grasses and sedges where seasonal fluctuations in water levels bring in more nutrients and allow for higher pH or less acidity. This change in vegetation from left to right becomes even more apparent when the boggy area on the right is separated from the river corridor on the left by a low conifer-dominated ridge. Black Pond Bog is another boreal lowland. We see conifer-dominated uplands grading slowly into conifer-dominated peatlands, and then into a large open bog populated by small black spruce near the edge of Upper Saranac Lake. The number of small black spruce trees visible in the more open area of this bog has some significance. Research shows that distinct bog plant communities occur in these open areas only when the black spruce canopy is about 50% or less. When hydrology, temperature, and nutrient availability prevent the establishment of new trees and suppress the growth rate of existing trees in bogs, the understory of distinct open bog plants can thrive. Conversely, when these factors limiting black spruce trees are removed and the canopy grows to exceed 50%, the distinct plants of open bogs are lost. Flying over Bay Pond Bog, we see again a hydrology gradient manifested in vegetation as we move from black spruce and tamarack-dominated areas at the edge of the peatland to orangish leatherleaf-dominated parts of the peatland. The open center of this peatland is dominated by pale yellowish sedges, Carex oligosperma, where the water table is closest to the surface. This vegetation pattern is reversed as we move out of the peatland. Sedges become sparse, shrubby leatherleaf dominates, and then we move back into forested peatland. The low gradient stream on the edge of the peatland, shown here, becomes channelized, leading to an interesting transition. The hydrologic gradient affecting vegetation distribution is clearly apparent here, as we see the verdant green sweet gale along the edge of the stream, where seasonal flooding supplies nutrients and rinses away acids built up from decomposition. The sweet gale transitions rapidly to the orangey, leatherleaf-dominated bog to the left that is hydrologically isolated. The hydrologic gradients within these peatlands are complex. Diversity of these lowland boreal habitats is a result of glacial geology, the hydrologic setting high in the watershed, and the steep gradients of pH and nutrient availability over short distances. The gray-black spruce trees we see in the peatland are stressed by competition with each other for light and by the wet and acidic environment in which they live. Some of these trees may be dead. The black spruce trees that inhabit these places do not prefer acidic peat soils. Rather, they are restricted to these sites because they can't compete with deciduous trees in the uplands, but they can tolerate the harsh environmental conditions of the peatlands. In acidic open bogs, black spruce trees can take up to 50 years to grow 1 meter high, making it difficult to estimate the age of these trees. Hitchens Pond Bog North also has patterning and is the southernmost patterned peatland in the eastern United States. You can see patterning with hollows of ponded water just before the island of trees to the left. Black spruce become established and grow slowly. They reproduce clonally in peatlands by adventitious sprouting of roots from lateral branches. Lateral branches grow out from the stem in the full light of the sun, but because they are resting on the ground, the branches are subsumed by the sphagnum mosses. These branches then sprout roots and become separate upright trees that are clones in a circle around the original tree. The establishment of trees in open bogs creates microsite conditions that are favorable to the further establishment and persistence of trees. Hummock and hollow microtopography is visible in Hitchins Pond Bog south, but it is not organized into long linear ridges indicative of patterning. Hummocks and hollows are distinguished here by the lighter colored hummocks and the darker colored hollows. The building of the railroad corridor through this bog in the late 19th century altered the hydrology of this site, making the peatland to the right of the railroad, seen to the right, slightly drier, allowing trees to establish. The gray black spruce trees we see in Clear Pond Bog are stressed by competition with each other for light and by the wet and acidic environment in which they live. This is another example of black spruce growing in a peatland, not because they prefer acidic peat soils, but because they can't compete with the deciduous trees seen in the uplands to the right and left, and because they can tolerate the harsh environment of the peatlands. Beaver have impacted a portion of this wetland complex by damming the stream seen just after the railroad in 3 places, creating or extending a lowland conifer swamp within and beyond the peatland. Larch trees, also known as tamarack, are tolerant of wet and acidic conditions but very intolerant of shade. The light green foliage of larch trees visible here turn golden yellow and shed in the fall, making larch the only deciduous needle-leaved tree in our region. Because larch is shade intolerant, it colonizes recently disturbed areas, like the areas below each of these beaver dams. Larch is distinguished by its light green foliage in this wetland, and likely established after the beaver dams were abandoned some time ago. Lake Lila Bog is located downstream, but in the same watershed as the Shingle Shanty Bog. An important characteristic of peatlands in the northern Adirondacks is that they are large and interconnected. The size and connectivity of these Adirondack peatlands means that the species dependent on boreal habitat may persist here longer than in other areas with small or isolated peatlands. Research on the ground within the Shingle Shanty peatland, seen here, documents environmental conditions of these sites. In 2014, temperature data loggers in the Shingle Shanty Bog showed that the longest period without frost for the entire year was 19 days. Vegetation research shows that there are 3 to 4 black spruce trees, less than 1 meter tall, per square meter, or about 14,200 per acre. Additionally, it is estimated that the site receives about 4.5 pounds of nitrogen deposition per acre per year, fertilizing this otherwise nitrogen-limited ecosystem at about 5% of the recommended amount required for commercial corn crop. The establishment and rate of growth of the small black spruce trees in the Shingle Shanty peatland, seen here, is suppressed by both the amount of precipitation, temperature, and nutrient availability. As these factors change, it is expected that the abundant tree seedlings present here will grow quickly, and the open bogs will shift to forested bogs, dominated by black spruce. If we look at an image of all of North America, the northern forest region is situated at the transition between the boreal forests, dominated by conifers and stretching 1,000 miles north to the treeless tundra, and the temperate forest, dominated by deciduous trees. This means that the northern forest region from coastal Maine and Nova Scotia to the prairie edge in Minnesota have characteristics of both of these global biomes. The peatlands of the Adirondacks are among the largest southernmost occurrences of these boreal ecosystem types, and are set within a landscape where the uplands are dominated by temperate species. Peatlands around the globe that occur in this narrow transition zone act as islands of unique habitats in a sea of temperate forest and contribute greatly to regional biodiversity. Northern temperate peatlands are threatened by human-caused global environmental changes like climate change, atmospheric deposition, land use impacts, and invasive species. Peatlands of the Adirondacks are unique among peatlands of the northern temperate region in that many were protected from land use impacts, such as agriculture and peat mining, over a century ago with the creation of the Adirondack Forest Preserve. What's more, their position high in the watersheds of a place with few roads has slowed invasive plants. While these protections have left Adirondack peatlands relatively intact, it means that the impacts of atmospheric deposition and climate change are the primary threats. Atmospheric deposition, better known in the Adirondacks as acid rain, comes from coal-fired power plants and agricultural fertilizer used upwind in the American Midwest. Prevailing winds carry various forms of sulfur and nitrogen and deposit them across the landscape. Nitrogen deposition threatens peatland biodiversity by changing the dynamics of plant competition in what is normally a nitrogen-limited landscape. Increases in nitrogen, a fertilizer, give vascular plants, and particularly woody plants, a competitive advantage over sphagnum mosses. Hydrology is the paramount environmental factor that controls peatland vegetation. Changes in climate, precipitation, and temperature alter peatland hydrology, and slightly drier conditions favor vascular plants, particularly woody species. What's more, cold temperature limits the growth rates of black spruce. Peatlands form at the bottom of basins where cold air sinks, creating a colder microclimate that may be significantly colder than surrounding landscapes for much of the year. Trees may be established here, but do not grow very large because of frequent and persistent cold temperatures. Atmospheric deposition and climate change together have been found to trigger relatively fast invasions of trees into open peatlands. Tree invasions diminish the diversity of species of both birds and plants in lowland boreal peatlands. Birds have less habitat diversity, and the unique plants of open bogs are shaded out by trees.